Hello, my name is Ruben Nelson. I'm one of the directors of CACOR. Welcome to the CACOR Live series. It's an adaptation that CACOR made to COVID, and then we realized we were onto something, and CACOR Live is now the best weekly webinar in Canada. It's the place where you will find an extraordinary range of perspectives on the human condition, on the human problematique, on who we are, who we need to become, and on activities of people, as we'll see today, who are hard at work making a difference. Today we have Ruth Waldick. I'm still getting to know her, but three things stand out. First, she presents herself as a person. Now, that may not sound like much, but in the modern world, we're taught to present ourselves as functionaries who have particular roles and certificates. Second, she has a passionate commitment and curiosity. You can see this in her education and in the work she has done. So she has a PhD. Her 3 degrees are from different places, which means she has moved around and had to learn different contexts. And she's passionate about relationships. And of course, as you build webs of relationships, you're into ecology. And you're into understanding contexts in a culture that is largely context blind. And so you can see this in her work at the Policy Research Initiative, which was an early attempt by the Government of Canada to follow the line of thought that Ruth has lived. That initiative turned into Horizons Canada and now Policy Horizons Canada, and we'll leave that for another time. But 2 quotes come to mind as I think of her and her work. One is the well-known quote by Reinhold Niebuhr. Most people don't realize that that American theologian wrote what is recognized as the prayer used by Alcoholics Anonymous, that includes the phrase, "Let me understand the things I cannot change." And one of the things you see in Ruth's work is the realization that's happening in our culture, but not at a very rapid pace, that we can actually, within limits, change the contexts in which we live. That we've done a lot of context change unconsciously and destructively, but we can actually learn to nurture new contexts into being, which then makes living easier, not just for human beings, but other living things. And secondly, Don Michael, whom some of you will know his work, Don spoke of being determined to make a difference in spite of all that stands in the way of making a difference. And I see that in Ruth, and Don would be pleased and admire her, as do I. Ruth, over to you.
Ruben, thank you so much for that really interesting and beautiful introduction to me. I want to thank everybody for being here with me today, and also for CACOR and his invitation to speak. And many of you may not realize, but I'm on the west coast of Canada, in a region of the Salish Sea, so the southern part of that with the Gulf Islands, which is situated between Vancouver Island and southern part of Victoria, where a bomb cyclone has been hitting us for the last couple of days. And so it wasn't clear that I was going to be able to join today, because being in a rural area, if our power goes out, things happen, and the urgent things take priority. But here I am, able to join you today. This area is an area of real interesting history in so many ways. Like from a learning perspective, It's the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and who had an approach which was to improve productivity, to look at medicines, to look at a holistic view of how to manage the system, their ecosystems, the marine systems for diversity, for maximizing diversity and productivity. And so that's been really removed as the settlers came in and applied a different land management practice, which has really created a lot of vulnerabilities. And so today, the way that I'm going to be approaching this is from a risk lens of adaptation. And adaptation being, in this context, is actions that help to reduce vulnerability to current or expected impacts from climate change. And there's a lot of discussion about where this should happen, a lot of different forms of focus. So there can be disaster and emergency related focus. There can also be the more resilience. This is something that I think is being discussed in the context of biodiversity right now at the COP. So there's many different aspects of the lenses that we might use. But I want to start off with just an example to set the context. So what I'll be discussing today is BC, which I think is an area that everyone now is relating as an example of what climate change and extreme weather look like. So you see this image here, and you're looking at the Sumas Prairie in southern BC. And this area in 2021 was flooded when we had some atmospheric rivers, and the area was flooded, and it was seen as an example of climate change and a disaster. So this was a disaster. The thing about how you hear things in the media is you have to look at things from different perspectives and what do different people think. And so the more local lens that you look at, you start to see different things coming up. So for example, the First Nations were very quick to say, well, actually, the Sumas Prairie was a lake until it was drained through dikes and damming to create this agricultural prairie. And there is some discussion about whether we should return to this idea of having a resilience-based approach and reducing our vulnerability in the area. But of course, it's not very popular because, in the time when we're concerned about food security, and this is a really important agricultural area, there's a lot of different ideas and ways of thinking about this. So today, my question to you, I wanted to present a question because I'm not presenting any answers to you. I'm gonna walk you through a real application of climate adaptation at the community-based level or the local level, where it had, I really think, as much support as one might expect for this kind of thing. And ask the question or get you to think as I'm talking about, is community-based adaptation the answer? And in some ways, yes, it is. But at the same time, are we perhaps asking too much of communities to be able to lead this? So I wanted to show some headlines that I've been looking at that are in the literature identifying community-based adaptation as the way forward. It's the solution. And increasingly, the literature is telling us that this is really the way to proceed. And so the question that I want to ask is, to what extent are we ready for that? So the talk is broken down into 3 sections. The first is a brief section where I want to introduce you to some of the extreme weather considerations in British Columbia, and then focus in on the coast, so a little bit of context. And then I'll go to a second section where I'm going to talk about specifically a real climate adaptation plan and look at a couple of concrete examples for including sea level rise and fire risk to give a sense of what does it mean when we're doing this locally. And then the final part, very briefly at the end, I'm just going to take a step back and look at some of the examples that I've provided and ask this question again. How's it going? What's the reality check on things? So as many of us have been discussing the last couple of days with the cyclone, and we had an extreme wind event last week, and we had an atmospheric river a few weeks back. This is increasingly becoming a common event when it was actually always happening, but much rarer, less frequent. And so now the consideration from a community perspective is, well, the scale of these things is also getting much bigger. They're lasting longer, they're much more intense, and they're crossing across traditional boundaries, or jurisdictional boundaries, and the mandates of different agencies. So if we want a local government to take action on something, they can only act within the bounds of their particular community. And as you imagine, if we're having severe flooding, as in this example here from 2021, the precedent, the actual priorities are always on the urgent and disaster related action. And that can last for years afterwards. In British Columbia, as you move, anywhere, you have fire risk, and we've seen in the last, since records have been started with fires across the province, which is over 100 years ago. In the last 10 years, we keep hearing that pretty well the worst fire years are accumulating in the last 10 or 12 years or so across the entire recorded history of fire. So the scope and scale of fire is becoming huge. And with fire, it's not just fire, it's also power service can go out, roads can be closed. It's the contamination and the health effects of the smoke. And the smoke may not just affect the people in that area that's being affected by the fire per se, but even along the coastal areas, so in the Salish Sea where I am, people can be affected by smoke when there have no fires going on. There's a community that some of my colleagues work on a little north of me on an island called Cortez Island. And when I was talking to their climate adaptation planning team, their priority was to build a facility where they could be clean air and air conditioning so that people on the island had somewhere to go to be safe and to escape this. So the climate, this is just to also point out that the priorities of an individual community can be quite different from each other. Also, there are many other aspects of climate change and extreme weather that people are hearing about and worrying about. So, for example, where I live, 1 year, I think it was during COVID, we got a message saying that we're no longer insured for fire. Our fire insurance was done, and we weren't the only one on the island. And of course, this causes a lot of panic, and it actually doesn't have anything to do with fire risk per se on Salt Spring, where I am, or across the Salish Sea, but just the general reaction to this increasing risk and impacts of fire that are affecting the community. Fortunately, again, another benefit of being on a small island is we have an insurance agent that is local, and they worked really hard to find a broker that would provide insurance for those of us who had lost fire insurance. So there are many urgent and pressing priorities for people. And then it's also very, very confusing. There's so many different opinions about what's the causes. But I have to say, when this article came out in 2021 in the National Post saying that you can't just blame climate change for BC being on fire, they really hit the mark. That fire is about much more. It's about management practice. So management practices that have been put in place since settlers arrived and increasing in scale and scope over that time are extractive based resources so the land management strategies are very single sector focused, and they're very intense in a way that is the complete opposite of the way that the First Nations communities interacted with their environment. So we're dealing with a very different environment now than we had been historically. And some connections to the impacts of forestry on other things like flooding are starting to appear. What you're looking at here is the province of British Columbia's perception or their assessment of fire risk for the province. And I hope you can see my cursor here, but you can see, it's what you would expect, that you start with green where it's relatively low, and then it gets higher going up to red. And this is really important because when fires are happening across the entire mainland of British Columbia, they have to prioritize urgent reaction, but at the same time, the province needs to be making plans for areas that they know are highly vulnerable. So for example, these areas that are showing the darkest red, where you also have urban centers, you have industry, you have the potential loss and economic impacts on the forestry sector, and you have people living there. So this is how they prioritize things. But I want to draw your attention here. So if you look at Vancouver Island, I'm just showing you Vancouver Island here in the southwest corner. And you see there's a huge area that's blocked out in gray, including, the Salish Sea is this area here between Vancouver Island and the mainland. And what I'll be referring to today are the coastal areas and the islands within that, where we have very high rural population. But so the question I have is like, okay, so why is this gray color? No data. So does that mean that there's no fire risk in this area? From the provincial perspective, that is, in a sense, what it means. This is not a priority because they have to prioritize according to their legislative responsibilities and the resource sector, and also looking at population density and the effects that it would have on economies. So the lens that they're using doesn't necessarily, it may encompass rural communities on the mainland, but it's not necessarily encompassing those on the eastern coast of Vancouver Island that you see here, and islands in the Salish Sea. So for these communities, we have the reverse situation, interestingly. So in this area, we have 80% private land ownership, whereas on mainland British Columbia, it's 80% Crown ownership. So the Crown also has a great deal more authority and mandate to respond there. But the question really is, where does this leave these communities that are in this gray zone? So I'm going to focus in now more on the gray zone. Never referred to it that way, but this is it's referred to in a number of different ways. Coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone, which is moist maritime. It's a very interesting area. It is globally unique. The only place that this particular community assemblage and ecologies are found is in a stretch of the Pacific Northwest that goes from this region of British Columbia and the coastal area down the coast of Washington State, and it's found nowhere else in the world. So it's a very unique area. If you ask people in this area what they think they're most worried about, it's wildfires. And so there's a discrepancy between what the province thinks is important and what the local people think are important. They're also concerned about water, but what you're seeing here is a compilation of surveys that I've done. When I give talks in the region, I set up a survey and I let people tell me what they think their priorities are, their priority concerns, and this is the compilation of that. So wildfire, without question, is the most pressing concern for people. This is for a couple of reasons. One is that people living in this area are embedded, and so they're embedded essentially in a wildland urban interface. And in fact, one of the top fire ecologists in the province who I've been working with, and I were speaking, and I said, is there anywhere with as high a wildland urban interface as in this region? He said, no, it's got to be the highest, what we call WUI, in the province. And that's because we have a situation where we had historic logging, so resource extraction, different kinds of land management and extractive activities. And then as the population in this region of BC started to spread and grow, because this is the most mild climate, it's a very nice area to live. It's also very close to Vancouver. You have the capital, Victoria, nearby. So there's lots of reasons that this has become an area where most of the population of BC chooses to reside. But as this happens, people are spreading into what used to be forestry areas, so areas managed for forestry. And I wanted to show an example here of why one might have concerns. So this is an area on Vancouver Island, Cumberland. People live. I've sort of honed in more on the town of Cumberland, but there's a lot of people living rurally. But what I'm looking at is just the how close Cumberland is to the encroachment of active forestry, which is a concern when it comes to fire because of the slash and the burning and the conditions associated with forestry, which increase the likelihood of fire for many reasons, including greater access for people to go up the roads, to go hunting, to go fishing, whatever, to go camping. And in this region and this along the Salish Sea, this coastal area or coastal Douglas fir area is largely the humans that are causing the risk of fire. So most ignitions are caused by humans and not by lightning strikes. So it's another really major difference between this area that I'm talking about along the coast and the mainland, where lightning strikes are actually involved. The other things you can see here is that forestry is not just affecting the risk of fire and the concerns around fire, but also as we get the heavy rains, and they are logging closer to the Comox Lake, which is a water supply for the community. The potential for erosion and fire and other sorts of contaminants entering the Comox Lake and affecting their water supply is also great. So there are many different aspects of living in this area that cause people to justifiably have concerns. And then if that isn't enough, there's the isolation. The isolation, particularly on the islands, but also in these Vancouver Island rural settings, where you are living far from your municipal government, or you may be in an unincorporated area. And so you don't have the services, you don't have access to the same things that people in a city would. In addition, across this area, there are relatively few paid firefighters, like employed full-time firefighters. Most firefighting groups across the islands and in regions of the coast in these rural settings, they do rely on volunteers to take care of fire. And so that is also something that puts pressure and creates worry, because we have people who aren't really properly resourced, responsible for taking care of things. And even if they aren't necessarily going to have to take care of things, in other words, BC Wildfire Services will come in and take care of a fire if it happens. At the same time, the worry is there with them every day because they live in the area and they see and they understand the risks. And so just knowing that, don't worry, if there's a fire, we can have someone there in 6 minutes, 9 minutes, a bomber to take care of it, is not reassuring to people. When you look at the islands, so here I've just done a blow up a BC Ferries map, and you can see that the islands also, including Vancouver Island, are isolated because of transportation. So in the case of any kind of extreme weather, such as the bomb cyclone that we're currently having, the ferries are canceled. And so this affects the supply chain. If you live on a small island, it affects if you're having a health event, you can't get off the island. I mean, it has many implications for individuals and pretty well all aspects of their life. So isolation is another factor. Okay, so that's the background for British Columbia and honing you in on the Southern Gulf Islands and the coastal areas that are largely rural. So that is not most of the population, but most of the land base, as you saw in that provincial map, is grayed out because there's lots of private land ownership, which, by the way, includes the forest lands owned by Mosaic and other forestry companies. So now I want to take a look at what we did on Salt Spring Island to set up an actual climate adaptation plan. So here you see, I want to show you where we're talking about. So this is that zone that I was talking about. The arrow is pointing to this somewhat gingerbread man. I think of it as a gingerbread man. So somewhat gingerbread man looking island. It's an island that has ferries, 3 different ferries. So we are less vulnerable than most islands. Probably because of that, it has the largest population, and we do have some government services, but it's quite limited on the island. So we just recently had hydro staff permanently positioned on the island after years of having difficulties when we have power outages for whatever reason. That can be windstorms, rainstorms. The ferries could be canceled and they can't get over. So this has been a really big improvement. But this also gives us access to more resources, even though we are unincorporated, which means that our government, although we have elected officials and a few staff on island, really the decisions are made off island in Victoria. And so we don't, there's limited capacity and services still on our island, although we're doing better than most. The climate action plan was something that happened. This was a take two, in a sense. The first one happened about 10 or 11 years earlier when the provincial government offered money for communities to create a climate action plan. And one of the people who went after this got a small group of people together. And, another thing I would say about small islands is people so that it's easy to know who the experts and the professionals, whether they're retired or active in different disciplines are, and try to bring them together on a problem. And so when there was another opportunity, so about 2018, he was CRD director at that time, the Capital Regional District, and he asked me, do you think we should redo the climate action plan and incorporate adaptation? And so we did this from 2019 to about 2021 when it was released. I want to give you a sense of the scope of that. So it was about 30 people, very passionate, as Ruben said, very passionate, people with different knowledge and experience that could be applied in this setting, from the farming community, from the permaculture community, from the business community, all kinds of different people. And we had a core group of about 30 volunteers working, I'd say pretty well full-time, and in some cases more, over a period of more than 2 years on this. So it's a huge effort. And I would also say that having been involved with a number of climate adaptation initiatives across Canada in different regions, that the plan itself is very well done. So it's not a general plan, it's actually quite specific. And that was purposely done to look at the different types of areas that we have concern about from the lens of mitigation and adaptation. So you see the list of them here. The extent to which they're comprehensive in looking at transportation or looking at land use is variable, because we have 30 people and you make do with the knowledge and the resources that you have at hand for something, but it's still very well done in that the work that was completed, there's some greenhouse gas emissions estimates made so that they could be compared to the previous plan. And then adaptation was incorporated. And then for each of these different chapters, the different actions, so over 250 actions and recommendations were put out, and they were broken down individually and identified by the lead organization or responsible authority who would be the lead on this. So a lot of energy went into trying to make this a useful reference document. Sorry, I think I just skipped 2 slides there. No, I didn't. Okay. So when we started to try to communicate it out, we also had some excellent communication and communicators and writers in our group. And so we produced a number of reports, and we were trying to communicate this. It seems so funny. It seems like so long ago, and yet just so recent. Here we were, here's some of the headlines that we were trying to use to engage people in conversations about what was coming in the future from extreme weather. And the reason why I have these up here is because in 2020 and 2021, when we were releasing these, we really were nervous about it, because it seemed like things that people would reject. Even though we'd had all kinds of large-scale fire events in the province, to bring it home, that was the question. Will people be able to translate this into the impacts here? Will they accept? How will they react to this? So the irony is all these things that we worried about putting up there as possible scenarios that we would be looking at, many of them have actually happened. So who knew? And it happened much faster than any of us. I mean, I think we all know this. Change is happening at a rate that no one had anticipated. The other part of the adaptation work was the risk assessment. And this is now the part that led to the climate adaptation work that I'm going to talk about. And so the risk assessment is something that I led. I've done it before. When I was working with the federal government, my real personal goal was to find a way for science to be integrated into policy and planning discussions. And so I came at this with experience and also able to find the right people to help with these various analysis and the use of the climate data projections. So the two examples that I'm going to talk about are the sea level rise and the fire assessment that we did. Okay, so here's our little gingerbread Salt Spring Island. And there are, on the left, what you see is the sea level rise maps that we produced. And this was using a very conservative projection by 2100 of 1 meter sea level rise that the Capital Regional District was using. So we used the same projection that was accepted by the regional government. And we produced these for, you see on the top here, this is the unincorporated village of Ganges, which I've circled in red here. The one on the bottom left is Fulford Ganges here at the bottom, which is, one of the areas that a ferry comes into. So any kind of sea level rise impacts on roads will be very important. And then the third is in a more residential community here, not far from Ganges. And just to explain what you're looking at, you're looking at in the blue-green, depending on your screen and the color, that is the 2020 king tide line. So when we have our highest water table, the highest sea level, just for natural circumstances using historic information, that is what we expect. That's the 2020 baseline for the king tide. When we add the king tide 2020 plus the 1 meter projection, then we get this yellow zone. So instead of the water level being just where the blue is, it starts to move up and it would cover. So there'd be basically this little piece of treed area which becomes an island because the water flows in here. It also backs up in this area here. So we start to have pooling and water coming up from the ocean. When we have king tide and we had 1.3 meters of storm surge, which is what we would expect, then you get the areas in red inundated. So now we're looking at a large part of the village being inundated during a storm event during the king tide season in the village. So I want to look a little deeper at this. And here's another take. So this is a different model that my colleague Nicholas Courtier made for us. And you can see that the details and the car parks are more evident here. But I wanted to show you how this relates to the actual village. So on the bottom right here, you see the village. And this is actually where the grocery store, so I'll point things out. So we've got the grocery store here in this yellow and red zone. We have the fire hall. Oh, the fire hall here. And so we're looking at, sorry, I got that wrong. Here's the grocery store up here, and here's the fire hall here. So these are two important services, and these are of concern. So my partner, Pierre Minot, who's on this call, who's a photographer and a scientist, I asked him if he would do some photo montages for me to try to communicate this a little bit better to the community. And so for the fire hall, what he did is he built in a visual photograph of showing the level at which this would look like in the case of the worst case scenario. So that's the 2100 if it coincides with storm surge. So basically the fire hall is in trouble. The good news is that we did put this out. We were trying to support the move of the fire hall, which was intended to be moving anyway, to update and modernize the fire hall for the current realities that the firefighters are facing. But I think that this didn't hurt for us to point out that this is maybe not the best place for us to have our fire hall. There was not a lot of comment that we received on this. Here's another photo showing you the grocery store in this area here. So it's interesting, I think, to look at this. And it starts to maybe, feel a little uncomfortable that, oh my goodness, climate change. And but the reality is, looking at the same image. So I'm showing you here. Oh, these seem to have danced around. Okay, here we go. This arrow here, I've aligned to this point here. And this black arrow on the right, I've aligned to here. So this is a photograph from the Historical Society in the 1940s and 1950s of Ganges. And the point that I want to make here is that actually there was no parking lots and land there. It was a cove. And so this is an example for me of how what we're doing is we're increasing our vulnerabilities. When we go back to fire, and we look at fire again. So with fire, if you look at it from the provincial perspective, where what they're looking at is the relative fire risk. And this is what their assessment is of Salt Spring Island. So the areas where they see moderate, so you see sort of a light green color, these are areas that actually have some Crown connections. So they're provincial parks or areas that have a Crown affiliation. Doesn't mean that there's no fire risk anywhere else. And so here's what you see when the Capital Regional District did their own wildfire exposure map. It looks very different to the provincial one. And so this is really important information. And so when we were working with the fire department and talking about fire risk and areas of concern on the island during the work of the climate action plan and the risk assessment work that I was doing, what came out was unequivocally one of the important areas for the community was here. This is called the Maxwell Creek watershed. This watershed, you can see the watershed outline here in the right image. This watershed has a lot of high fire potential areas around it, and it is an important water supply for almost half of the people on the island. So there's unquestioningly this, if we're going to do some work somewhere, this is where we should prioritize. I asked every organization and group, conservancies, the Capital Regional District, the Island Trust, and everyone was in agreement. So there's a lot of agreement. There was a lot of agreement through this climate action plan. And so we agreed that this was an area, this watershed was an area to focus on to understand fire more. The sort of short explanation of what's going on here is this is a former logged area. It's gone through at least 2 series of clear cuts, some historic large-scale fires. It's regrown incredibly dense. You can see that the density on the right-hand side photo. This density and the health of the forest is what is creating some of the risk. This kind of continuous single-age forest, very simplified with not much ground cover, not many openings, not much tree or species diversity is not normal. This is a post logging forest, basically. So what we did for this area is I worked with a forester. So everything I'm saying, I might say we, but I worked with professionals. And this one was done, the fire risk layers were done to help us to understand using remote sensed and geospatial data where the relative risks were so that we could get a sense of where we should prioritize any kind of actions in the watershed, because we have only limited ability to deal with things, limited resources, which is very little money. and we don't have much expertise because it's an improvement district, so North Salt Spring Waterworks District, who's responsible for delivering the potable water to the community, but that's what they do. They don't manage forests to reduce fire risk. So this is another example of how the sector, a mandate can really influence what's possible. But fortunately, the whole community, including North Salt Spring Waterworks, agreed that this is something we should be doing collectively. This continuous red stream that you're seeing here is the canopy fire risk. And I've got a picture there to show you this. And this is basically just to show you that when tree canopies are in contact with each other, and if a fire were to get up into the canopy, it would spread very quickly. And so what we want to do is to identify how a fire would move if it were to get into the canopy. So it looks pretty bad. The whole watershed has a very high risk of canopy to canopy spread. We also did coarse fuel and fine fuels, and you can see that it's more patchy. Of course, where it has to do with if we've had a windstorm, our trees have died and succumbed and they've fallen over, then we have a lot of coarse wood on the ground, like you see in the photo on the right. And when the branches are falling off the trees because they're light limited, then you get an accumulation of the fine materials. But interestingly, in this watershed anyway, because of the closed canopy, there's not a lot of overlap. So on the left, you see that there's not much coarse within that circle that I've drawn, but there's quite a bit of fine. So if you think about this in terms of making a fire, if you make a fire and you put large logs on it, it's going to be hard to start the fire. If you make a fire with fine fuel, so ones that are under as I'm told, under the diameter of your thumb, that it's going to ignite and it's going to burn out really quickly if it doesn't catch into something more substantial to burn. So it's when these things come together that you have a problem. And what we don't want is don't want these things to come together and then for the fire to move up into the canopy where it could spread across the watershed. So going back to the reality that fire is largely caused by human beings in this area, we could use an ignition risk lens to identify in red those sites where we think that human activity is such that there's a higher probability of an ignition at the same location that we have fine fuels, coarse fuels, and closed canopy, and also fire ladder, which I haven't shown. So it's when all these things come together, so when we put our layers together, that we're able to identify priority areas for us to focus on creating gaps. So here's another take on that. And so I'm showing you a little bit here. The dark blue squares are areas where we have all these things coming together and we have the high canopy transmission fire potential. So within here, this little area is an area that we managed to pull together a demonstration of a concept of how to reduce fire risk. So the idea with this is to reduce fire risk by breaking up the canopy and not doing it in a forestry kind of context because they remove trees at equidistance. So those canopies grow back very quickly and close things out, but to do them as if a large tree had fallen down. So we want to create larger gaps. And this is a practice called variable density thinning, the concept which is used in Oregon and Washington, which are really taking the issue of fire more seriously because of their experience. But I think the way to think of this is in any population, you want to have individuals of different ages. So you want to have babies, you want to have old, you want to have everything. And by opening this up, we're creating more of that diversity that's missing in the age structure. Because as the trees get old, the more we have old and healthy trees that aren't at risk of falling down because they're so close together, then they're able to get the thick bark that makes them fire resistant. And in the coastal Douglas fir zone in this whole region, a large number of the native plants actually are quite fire resistant. So this technique is sort of what we had in mind. It is different from the approach that's recommended provincially, which in these kind of private or community public settings, and I hope you can see here on the sign on the left, there are two photos. And on the top, you can see it looks kind of like ours. It's very dense tree trunks, and there's wood on the ground. And then they came in, and this is BC Wildfire Services probably working with the community, or maybe part of their Fire Smart program. And they came in, and then the lower photo, they've taken care of it. So they've done a little bit of thinning, but they've removed the wood off the ground. And you can see it's still very dark. It's still an ecological desert. The trees are still overly dense. And from a biodiversity perspective, it's not going to be very productive. So we want to avoid this, and it's also not necessary to do this. This is just an approach when it's urgent. So along a trail, if there's materials beside you that could ignite, then they're dealing with that, not dealing with the big picture. But they're doing it in a very pragmatic way rather than the way that we're suggesting. So what we did in this small area is we cut a number of trees, and we did a different approach where what we focused on is retaining trees. We wanted to retain large trees. We wanted to retain large standing dead trees. We wanted to retain some wood on the ground, so that we're trying to increase the structural complexity and just create more light and space. And so we had, this is Robert Seaton, the colleague who's given so much of his time and expertise. I cannot thank him enough. You can see he's marking trees so that we can do this kind of targeted thinning. And then you see what the outcome looks like on the right. Doesn't look too bad there, but believe me, when we had to deal with it, it was a lot, because if you think about it, when we cut trees, we also have to do something with the fuels that are left on the ground, because the area we picked is in an ignition, high potential ignition zone. So we wanted to make sure that we manage the fuels in a way where the wood in a way that it would not be a fuel. So I'm just going to show you sort of what we did. We stole from the permaculture community established protocols like hugelkultur. And the goal here is to take some of this wood, put it together. This is an experiment, and the results aren't in yet, but we're going to start analyzing some of the data soon. But what we did is we basically created what we're calling assembled nurse logs. So it's like an old log that falls down. We're replacing some of these large carbon features, wildlife habitat areas for seedlings and plants to grow in this system, and putting things together in a little kind of hugelkultur structure. So I won't go into that, but I've got some links there. You can look into this more. There's some articles on it as well. And what you see here on the left is a nurse log immediately after it's been finished. And I can explain some of the design afterwards. But then a year later, you can see that it's really already starting to grow over with the native blackberries and other plants. So it's starting to become integrated into the system. The question we have is about how much moisture can they hold? And that's the results that I'm looking forward to analyzing soon. The other thing that we did is we also we did mycelial inoculations. So we were interested in these logs. So we have a lot of logs on the ground. If we're going to do this in the watershed, what we don't want to do is have to physically move things around a lot. It is fun. We had the restoration of natural systems students come to be involved with this. We had people from the high school of Southern Gulf Islands High School came to help. We had members of the community come to help. There's a lot of very easy to get volunteers to do something like this, but it's still, as you keep doing this, the scope and scale of moving things around becomes quite challenging and onerous, and it's going to take a lot of time. So can we actually help to advance the moisture retention and decomposition of some of these large materials on the forest floor without having to move them? And so we inoculated with mycelium from a stump taken from the area. And a lot of this idea comes from a permaculturalist, very smart fellow, Tal Engel. And we are now just getting the first results, and you can see on the right. Oh, yes. So this is, I was very excited. So this is basically 17 months after we cut into these logs and inoculated some, and some we didn't inoculate. So we have about 120 of them out there that we're going to go start taking measures from. They are full of mushrooms. So it looks like this worked, and it's not a surprise because permaculturists have been doing this for a long time, but still, it was still very rewarding. From all this work that we've done and the conversation about fire, which necessarily has taken me to universities, to UBC, to the University of Victoria, to foresters, to many different individuals, has started to create a bit of a community of practice. And from this, we've kind of created a science hub that we're calling the Climate Adaptation Research Lab, or CARL. It was the starting point for it, the climate action plan, and the community decision for us to work in the Maxwell Creek watershed on the issue of fire. And it's continued since then with us doing work involving members of the community, having discussions, because the problems that we're having here are not isolated to Salt Spring. And a big part of what we're doing is to test ideas and to engage people in conversations across the different islands and the rural communities. And so we're well on the way to having these discussions. And our vision is to create a community of practice so we can share practices and also experts, because no one island has got the capacity on site. You see my crew, some of my crew members there. It's been very fun working with smart young people. But I also want to make the point that, like, this is what it took. So that's a lot of names, and I don't want people to read it. And I am, in a way, thanking everybody, because it's been amazing, the number of people who have stepped up to help and give me time. But this is a large endeavor to pull this off. So in closing, what I wanted to do is I wanted to do a reality check. And so let's take a look at how climate adaptation is going at the community level. So I decided that what I would do is summarize it in these kind of coarse buckets for simplicity, and walk you through some of them. Overall, so I've broken it down into the climate action plan in general as a process for the risk assessment work, the sea level rise work, and then the second part is the fire risk reduction piece specifically. So if we just look at the climate action plan, so this was basically, the work was done in 2019, 2020, and it was released in 2021. I'd say that the product, as I mentioned, was really good. The risk assessment and sea level rise work that we did are very good products. The science is, is questionable because we're relying on data being somewhere inaccessible. But the reality is, even some of the data that was used for the emissions calculations from the first version of the climate action plan that had been collected by government, they had terminated those programs and there weren't comparable values. And we had a team of people killing themselves, literally, trying to figure out how to legitimately get equivalent data and to use it and to interpret it correctly. So it was a huge amount of work. And so data, and also if you look at, if you remember the map of the province, we're in this gray zone because of the high private land ownership. And so there really is no science going on here. There aren't data. The uptake, I'd say, from the product has been yellow. By yellow, I mean, it's a bit of a struggle. It's good, but it could be better. And that's mostly because Transition Salt Spring is a handful of people who are continuing to, they've adopted in the organization the climate action plan and working with the community to engage people in action as their complete focus. But this is a handful of people, and they're mostly working part-time. So that is, that is unfortunate. I think I feel that it's sad, because the kind of work that we've produced is relevant, and the agencies could be looking at the specific roles they could be playing. But I think the reason it's not happening is because there's the urgent, immediate things that people are looking at, or the priorities they're already working on, something disaster or urgent that has just come up. And, there was somebody who said to us, just give me the top 5 or the top 10. That's not how this works. So there's still some issues there. Sustainability, for all these reasons, I have some concerns about. And the financing for the whole thing. We were given $15,000 total to do this. So 30 people plus others in the community worked like fiends for almost nothing. And the burnout level is very high, although people are very proud of it and they're still active, but they cannot maintain this particular role. It's not possible. For the risk assessment component, it's kind of the same thing, that I feel pretty good about everything. There's some discussion of the work from the Climate Action Plan with some of my colleagues in Transition Salt Spring, as the official community plan is being opened for reassessment because it currently doesn't consider climate change. But as with everything, we don't have people. So we are relying on grants, short-term money to keep things going. And then there's the Maxwell Creek Watershed Project is in the same boat. So it's very tenuous, the grasp of us continuing to do this. For sea level rise, you see a lot of blacks there, because I'd say that there's been no uptake. I think we did a great product and it's very relevant. And I just wanted to remind people that this other point here, which is where the ferry terminal comes in, Fulford Harbor, which goes to Victoria. This is the only road that takes some people to that ferry if they're coming from the, this left lobe, the left leg of the gingerbread man. And look at this, it's going to get washed out. And there's no conversation going on about this that I'm aware of. So this is something that is still, I don't see any, and with the Ganges maps, I think we upset some people because we're showing things about private land, and that may also be a similar situation here. This land here, this used to be, they've put a dike up here, well, not a dike, a causeway, because this used to actually be an estuary that would have been really good for absorbing storm surge and the power of storm surge, but it's private land. And anyway, so there's, I think there's some issues there with government inability to do things. With the fire risk reduction, and I'm looking at the time, and I'd like to not take too much time, but this is my last slide. The overall, we've been running on peanuts. And so all the work that I was talking about was done on $35,000 cash over 3 years. The bulk of the work was done through volunteers. So I'd say I've figured that I'm getting, for every dollar that I have in cash, I get $3 to $4 of in-kind. So $100,000 grant from Environment and Climate Change Canada, I can leverage into somewhere between $450,000. It's a lot, but it's a lot of work to do that. The thinning, what came up in the thinning was that we didn't have anyone on island who was able to do it. And there was a whole bunch of steps that are required officially, because this kind of cutting where you're selectively cutting is something that there are actually no skills in British Columbia among the foresters to do anymore. So there was a whole bunch of things that we had to do, and I don't have a background in forestry. So I've just summarized that by saying that there's no local capacity. With this and with the fuel management, where we're getting the most interest is from the practitioner community from across this whole region. Everybody's talking about this. And so we are coming together around this. The last thing that I wanted to point out is that with the fuel management, it's been the easiest thing to do in a sense, because that is volunteer driven. And so that has been really easy. And so to come back to the question that I posed at the front end, are we asking too much of communities, of local individuals to run something like this, when there's just the legitimacy, the acceptance of the products that we're producing, even when they're correct and scientifically rigorous, are not being accepted? And there's that side of it, but there's also this other side of urgent disaster priorities, other things that are always going to be there. And so the question is, are we asking, maybe, is it reasonable to ask communities to take this kind of thing on? So this is my presentation, and I just wanted to thank the funders and key contributors that I've had in this, and open up to questions.
Wow. Ruth, you have opened up a lot of things to questions. Art will ask a question after you respond to my question. As host, I get to ask the first question. And of course, there are lots of them. But I guess what I want you to do is the question that was central to your presentation, your own reflection. I mean, this in some level is so extraordinarily sane to see what you're doing as significant from a host of dimensions that you would, at some level, think that our major institutions, I'm thinking foundations, governments, universities, corporations who are in the business in a way that they depend on this, that this would be a no-brainer in terms of really serious support. And that therefore the answer to your question would be, no, it's not too much to ask, because in fact the value of it is seen, but your question is real because the value is not seen at that level. That the amount of money and effort, the amount of money you're talking about coming from, it's not even a rounding error of a rounding error. It's trivial. So my question is, and I'm sure you've given this thought, what is it about our situation that keeps our major institutions from understanding that this pattern of response is golden and right in front of their nose, but they can't see it?
Well, I think the immediate answer is bomb, cyclone, fire, highway washout, town goes up in flames. I mean, these are the things, and that the government puts all its effort into that. And then you do see that universities are trying to, some academics are trying to do this kind of work. But of course, the academic institutions aren't really set up to facilitate this kind of more controversial and, I think, exploratory, like it's less concrete in many ways. So they're doing their best to get the science, but of course there's a lag time for them to show things. Like there was a link between the forestry practices on the mainland and the landslides and, you know, the flooding. And so it takes a while for this to happen. So you have this constant lag time. But I think overall, probably the main part is just mandate. So when you look at, I mean, I really think that fire map of the province where they're saying, well, this is our relative assessment of fire risk. And that is, I read their whole, it's 2,000 pages. I actually read the whole risk assessment. And what you see is it's very specifically targeted at those areas that they have used their own priority lens because of their mandate and their obligations under legislation to address. And those are their top priorities. And other things just simply do not appear. So they are trying to create some tools. But for when you come to rural areas where you have private land ownership, the tools are like, for example, the Fire Smart tool. They took it from first it started in the United States. They took it up into Alberta. It made its way into BC. They applied it without thinking about it. And now they're retrofitting it because it wasn't really a good fit. So I think it's part of the problem is that it's nobody's real mandate. Fire Smart is the only tool that they have when it comes to fire. It's about protecting infrastructure within 30 meters of your home is the priority. So it's who's doing the bigger stuff? Nobody. And I think I just have to think that mandate has a big part of it.
Thank you. Art, if you would, there you go. The floor is yours. And Claude, you will be up next, just so you're ready.
Yeah, Ruth, you blew me away with the detail. Just an amazing piece of work. However, in most parts of the world, at least the literature that I read, associated with hurricanes, wildfires, and extreme weather events, one of the big things that happens is the power goes out. And that immediately impacts water for drinking, cooking, hygiene, for fighting fires, communication, transportation, shelter, food, blah, blah. It has a huge impact across the board. But I didn't see this even mentioned in everything you presented. And I'm kind of wondering, is there something I don't understand about how the grid on Salt Spring Island is set up that makes this such a low risk?
Well, I would say that in terms of the power, I mean, there's a lot of things I didn't talk about. There's the storm surge and damage to the ferry terminals. That means that we get, we have damage to the docks and the ferries can't land. And, so there's a whole bunch of things I didn't talk about. But in terms of the hydro, it goes out a lot. Trees come down, the hydro goes out. I think that it is an issue, but it's such a common occurrence that what's happened, at least on Salt Spring, is we've had hydro people positioned on islands so that they can respond more quickly. And so that's been the response. So again, it's like you have something happens and you treat the symptom of it, right? So that's what we're doing. Power gets restored quite quickly overall because some of I mean, again, I'm very fortunate on this island. All of us are very fortunate here because some of the lines that go to the other Gulf Islands, like Galliano and the Penders, and I'm not sure about Pender actually, but some of the other Gulf Islands, they come through via Salt Spring. So Salt Spring has become a priority. And we have a hospital, so that makes us a priority as well, for at least for the village of Ganges. So hydro is being dealt with, but it was beyond really the scope of the group that was working on the climate action plan, because they were focusing on very much on electric vehicles and with this kind of private land ownership and the reliance on off island sources of power. It's not clear how we could do anything on the island. So we have a lot of trees, the sunlight hours and the overcast gray skies are really high. Who's going to lead an exploration of that? And so it just hasn't happened. It's not that it doesn't matter. It's just that, again, in a rural area with a lot of private land ownership, how does that conversation get started even?
All right, thank you.
And after Claude, Barry Bruce, you'll be up, just so you know. Claude, your question.
Oh, thank you so much, Ruth. My question actually is in regard to, well, maybe I'll encourage you. I live in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, and there is an emergency climate plan for well, actually, it's a general emergency plan. And I have not seen the plan because it seems to be a private document that is kept by the fire department, interestingly. And but I have seen the table of contents, and the last item on that table of contents is volunteerism. And I point this out whenever people talk about the future of our community. So what you're doing is actually prototype work, and I thank you so much. And I hope it's well documented. And someday I see the film about your work on YouTube besides your talks. The question I have is that 1 meter that you used, water rise. What is that? Is that just arbitrarily taken? Let's just see what happens with 1 meter without a timeline.
No, it did have a timeline. So I purposely removed timelines because I think the timeline has changed. So I think that's like, I would call that 2050 personally, but of course, nobody working in the ocean realm will actually give you a number anymore. It's really hard to find anything. And by the way, NOAA, oh, I bow to NOAA. What an amazing organization that is. Unfortunately, all the data analysis terminates at the Canadian border. And so we don't have an equivalent sort of data set like you do in the United States, which is absolutely incredible. losing my train of thought here. Claude, remind me what your question was. It was
About the 1 meter, I think you very wisely, and
So
you've actually made my point, is that timelines are telescoping.
Mhm.
They're always, they seem really far out. If my grandchildren will have to worry about that. No, my children will have to worry about that. Oh my God, I will have to
I have
worry
to-
about
yeah.
that.
Well, I do. And so just to the final answer, the first answer to that question is actually we had originally said 2100 in our climate. So if you look at the risk document that I prepared, it does say 2100 for that, because that we used the capital regional districts, the value that they had chosen to use. And my colleague, Nicholas Cortier, who did all this work, he contacted the people in the CRD to talk to them about that 1 meter. He said, this isn't up to date, your map, anyway, he was talking to them a lot about it. And they said, we know that it's already too conservative. Even when we were doing this, they already knew that. And it was based on old data as well. And they said, but this is what we're using. And so we went conservative. And I think it makes the point that even going conservative, it looks pretty bad. Like you don't really have to you don't have to make it look worse. It's pretty bad.
Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing your research. I think it's very important work.
Thanks, Claude.
Dave Doherty, you will be up after Barry Bruce.
Thanks, Ruth. I'm struggling to relate your dilemma with ours. We're in Eastern Ontario, and we're dealing mainly with agri-food. And our feeling is that agri-food contributes a lot to climate change, also to poor health. And we can do a lot by by transforming that. We're at the point now where we think coming out of our not-for-profit, there's a business opportunity. And that business opportunity is that of providing sustainable local food, and especially for our area, which is a food desert, as it turns out. And the alternative forms of growing are what we would stimulate. So you talk about a great product, and I'm impressed as well. So is there a business opportunity that might be lurking out there for you?
Oh, well, my first thought is I did work in Eastern Ontario with the International Institute for Sustainable Development and Scott Mitchell from in Geography at McMaster, and we produced some reports. We did a scenario analysis looking at different trajectories of land management in Eastern Ontario. And I was told I was crazy by people who did scenarios at the time, because they said there's nothing's going to happen here. It's just you're working in the wrong area, and there's you're not going to be able to detect a difference between they told me to do the IPCC scenarios, right? And I didn't. I consulted with farmers and people and put together realistic scenarios, and then we ran these scenarios, and you should find it on the International Institute for Sustainable Development, I think, site. If you type in Eastern Ontario, you should find it. Or Livia Bizikova. Maybe Pierre can put her name in the chat. You will find, a lot of thought went into that area, and the policies, ultimately it's policies that need to change on the taxation of land and to support what we call garden farmers. And so we did. Anyway, you'll find it very interesting. So the business opportunity, man, I don't know. I mean, I wondered about, we did take one large tree off, and boy, that was a lot of paperwork and process to figure out. And then also to find a mobile scaler to bring them on the island. Like if I didn't have connections to professionals all over, like if I wasn't afraid to cold call people and ask them to do things, I wouldn't have done anything. But it was very hard to do. We managed to get one large tree off the watershed, and I gave it to an eco-forester He has his own, he's planning for, I think, 1,000-year time frame with his forests. That's his harvest plan, is 1,000 years. And so I gave it to him and I said, do something value added and see what this would look like. So it was one tree, part of it was diseased. And in the end, I think it was, he didn't do the highest end product that he could, but it was something like $3,500 from one tree, which is pretty good. I mean, if we get a couple trees like that, and there's still, you could see there's a lot left on the ground. We want to leave trees on the ground, but there's so many that we could take some. We should be in the 1,000 to 1,500 trees per hectare, and we're in the 2,500 to 4,000 trees per hectare. So there's a lot of trees that can come out of there without causing any difficulty. And they're about 80 years old, so they have some value, except all the people and the expertise, they just isn't here. And I'm not going to start a community. People saying, you know what, you need to start a forest cooperative. No, I don't. I'm already pretty busy. So right now, Barry, if you have any suggestions, let me know because I just don't know.
I think you've probably matured as a volunteer organization, and you've done some valuable, as somebody said, prototype work. And now I think it's time for business industry to take it over. What I'm thinking about is there must be industries that are threatened by fire. How about the insurance industry as well? The insurance industry seems to be affected more than anybody else. Is there a chance that they would fund something to reduce at a large scale, to reduce the risk for widespread damage and insurance claims? So that's just what I can think of off the top of my head.
Barry, I was on that back like in 2008, 2010. That's what I thought. I thought it's the insurance companies. But guess what they've done? We can see what they've done. They just drop policies, they increase premiums. I mean, they reduce what they offer. So unfortunately, like I thought that was going to be the answer. I think, where I've had the best success. Right now I'm working with the Gulf Islands Secondary School, which is the high school for all of the Southern Gulf Islands. And it also has some international students. And a teacher has asked my team to help to develop the science program that they wanted to have an immersive grade 11 and 12 environment program. And so I think a lot of it is kind of talking to young people who are excited and passionate, and having those people, it's getting more people talking about is the only thing I can think of. I've been relying on the internship programs that the federal government's been offering, which are probably they max out so quickly, I can't even get them anymore, but where they cover 50 to 75% of intern salary. But I'm pushing on getting people, training them, getting them out, getting people, training them, getting them out. And that's kind of that's the model that I've been using.
Well, maybe everybody here can come up with the answers.
And then write me something, please. Yes, I would love that.
Thank you so much.
Mary Hagan, you will be up after Dave Doherty. Dave, over to you.
Thank you, Ruben. Very interesting talk, Dr. Waldick. Thank you very much. I would like to pose the following question. What difficulties did you find in making adaptation plans when we don't have much evidence about all the impacts that will occur from this uncontrolled global atmospheric modification experiment?
What challenges did I have? That's a big question, Dave.
Ruben might say I'm known for that.
I have I think some of the biggest challenges were being taken seriously. Because it doesn't matter what I did when I was in Ottawa. It doesn't matter that I have a PhD. Who am I? I'm working with an NGO.
You haven't been a wrestler.
Does that help? Oh, okay. I guess there was a wrestling thing that I missed, but
oh well, so the wife of Vince McMahon from WWE or whatever it was,
okay.
Trump actually was in the wrestling ring one day and got beaten up. As much. I think there was more blood coming out of him than from that shot he experienced recently.
Okay, that seems
Anyway,
very
she's been
bizarre.
appointed to the U.S. cabinet.
Well, you know, I think the other challenge, I mean, the other challenge, yeah, you're saying other people aren't taken seriously and they still rise, but you know, maybe I'm aligning myself with the wrong group. I don't know. But the other one really is the denialism. So what I find is even in working with people who are what I would consider to be activists up and down the coast of BC, climate activists, and like these are professional climate activists, the I don't want to say grief because grief is just so overused, but the even among that group, accepting this, looking away from emissions reduction to look at this is not welcome. So I think, and that's part of the human being, right? That humans can amazingly accept anything. They can accept any, of course, you get knocked off kilter for a bit and then you accept it. Look at COVID. Post-COVID, everyone's back to the way we were. Look at 2008, the global collapse. Like we just, oh, okay. And then we go back to the way we were. And that is, I think, I've thought about this a lot. I think that's a Homo sapien feature to not become overwhelmed and to continue to move forward is just to diminish the importance of something and keep going. And so if we look around, I think I'm fairly pessimistic. If you look around the globe right now, I'm not sure climate change is going to be seen as important. We might have been there, done that. So we'll see. We'll see. I'm concerned that part of the problem is human beings.
Interesting, especially since one of the new cabinet appointees in the United States, I don't remember whether it's, I think it's the guy who's been put in charge of the Department of Energy, which actually also oversees the American nuclear arsenal, said climate change isn't happening. We don't have a crisis.
That's why it's better to talk about extreme weather. That is happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder what he thinks about that, though. Anyway, thank you.
John Legge, you will be up after Mary Hagan. Mary, over to you.
Thank you. Ruth, thank you for a fascinating presentation on how work can be done in detail at a community rural level and how you documented it and motivated the step-by-step process of involving volunteers. You ended off your presentation and saying that are these adaptation actions asking too much from community-led work? And it's a question that haunts my community and my volunteer work here in rural Ottawa. And I wondered if you have had time and resources to document what have been the motivations of volunteers and their capacity over time to make even what you've got achieved possible. And what are the sort of psychosocial and political assets needed in a community to even try what Salt Spring Islands has been doing? I want to go back to my volunteer groups that I'm working with and look at your documentation as much as it's available online. But that will be that we need to learn from you.
Mary, I think so volunteers, we're in a situation where people want to stop talking about things and they want to do something. And what I've found is that at first when I had funding, which is so small, and I was using it, anyway, I ultimately decided that, you know what, volunteers, people are dying to do this, and I'll just give them food and drinks and give them a really fun time, right? Because right now people are feeling hopeless. People are feeling disempowered, and just physically doing something like, come on, we're going to go do this. Like bioswales. If you want to manage fine fuels, just get a group of people together and teach them, get a permaculturalist to teach them how to make bioswales. You're putting carbon in the ground. I mean, there's everything there. You're improving soil conditions, soils at microbes are now being found. Microbes in soil are like everything. So I think I haven't done that. I've made a note. I think I need to do that. I could send out a questionnaire. We haven't done that. I've been very science focused and more technical focused, but I think that it's truly the biggest motivation is here's a short-term event that you can come out and you can do this thing and it's physical. It's not blah, blah, blah. It's that the first time when we were building those assembled near slugs, there's a link to a video in the presentation when we did that. And I'd been planning for it for like, I don't know, a year and a half or something like that, with all kinds of things going wrong, difficulties. Anyway, when we got to that day and I had the high school students, the university students all tromping around, carrying buckets, carrying lugs, doing this, doing that. And I stopped at one point, like the project manager that I was, and I looked around and I just like, I took a breath because I thought, wow, look at these people. They just want to do this. They're not joking around and laughing. They did, but they were working. And I think I've influenced some of them to feel more hopeful about things that are within their ability to do. And that's the opportunity people are looking for.
That's great. That makes sense. Anyway, you've inspired me. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
And John Legg, if you would ask your question, and yours will be the last question from our group.
Ruth, it's almost overwhelming what you do in terms of breadth of activities. And I would imagine that is a service in itself to all your volunteers and those people you've involved, because it seems to me it could be quite depressing. Now, my question, it almost seems trivial when it comes to when you're hammered out there by, first of all, fire, and then comes the overabundance of rains. What does that do to the soil in terms of absorbing water? It's almost a trivial question when you started off by pointing out that if you go back far enough, all these smaller bodies of water were really one big lake. So anyway, I'd just like you to go into a bit of detail as to what happens to the soil, and then there's always this reference to logging, and again followed by rains.
Yeah.
All I can imagine is that it would be a disaster in many ways. But
Yeah.
how do these links work out in reality? That's my question.
Well, John, thanks for the question, because I realized that I neglected to mention part of the reason that the work in the Maxwell Creek watershed was so important. There was the fire risk, and then also there are real problems with sediments and phosphorus loading towards the lake. And so that directly from erosion, and most of that erosion in that area is coming from the road itself. So, but that is the heavy rains. The road is pretty impassable. There's a lot of conversation in the community about, do we repair the road? Do we decommission it? Because no one lives down there. But how did the emergency vehicles get there? Right now, they can't get there either. So, so that is actually another issue there is the heavy rainfall and the sediments. But overall, when it comes to soil, I had the privilege of working with co-authoring a paper on drought with Barry Bonsai and some other people from Health Canada and Public Health, and I learned a lot in working on that paper. And what I learned was that it's well known that after a drought, the public health is most concerned about the heavy rain that always follows a drought, because that's the way airsheds work and watersheds, like airsheds work. So after you have, a prolonged drought, which is what's happening for us here, and then on top of that, you take these impoverished forests with very little, we've just been removing things and removing things. And in some areas of the watershed, I think that the fire probably had removed all the carbon and it's back down to mineral soil, even though there are trees in it. We have this dry, compacted soils that are unable to absorb water. And so then you have contaminants, bacteria, dead things that are washing away when you get the rainfall. And I wonder if some of the native plant seeds are also washing away. And so that I wonder if we even have a seed bank anymore because of this. So there are a lot of concerns with that. And we're just getting into the soils now. I've had a permaculturalist, Jane Squires, who's passionate about soils, approach me with some ideas, and we're going to be doing some trials to see how we can address the issue of the impoverishment of the soils to improve the water holding capacity, because that's what the idea with the nurse logs and leaving the woody materials on the ground and getting more vegetation that is deciduous that will drop leaves and then start to recover that absorbent organic layer, which currently is, it's traditionally very thin in these soils, but it's especially been impacted over the last 120 years of logging in the area. So it is really a concern. And I think that in many ways, soils are the answer. So I'll just, one other thing that I like to talk about is how, when we go, the other thing that goes on is with roads and with agriculture, historically, there is ditches and trenches and people, where's the best place? If you've got a forest, the best place to grow is you drain a swamp and you got beautiful organic soil. You didn't have to take any trees down, right? And you have a water supply. So when I looked at the watershed and we see that there's a lot of this and it's covered over now and you could almost not know that it's there. So thanks to bare earth layer and LiDAR, wow, do I love LiDAR. And so, you look at that and you can see the history below the ground that's no longer visible to the eye when you're on the surface. And when I went up to the headwaters, which is a spring at the bottom of a mount, with a wetland restoration expert, and we took a look, and basically my layman's interpretation is that the water table at its maximum right now, because of all the trenching and ditching, which is still in place, is probably about 90 centimeters or so below what it could be. In other words, we have something like 2 to 3 feet of extra space that could be filled up with water if we could plug all the irrigation and ditches that was in there. And that would be a starting point, not just for the soils, but for these shallow rooted trees like Douglas fir. Well, Douglas fir is less so, but Western red cedar. They have very, very shallow roots. So when you say we have a drought period, the drought periods are getting longer. The water table is low because of all these historic effects. Then that means that the number of days that the roots of the cedar are actually in contact with the watershed is reducing all the time. So the question I keep saying is, to what extent is this climate change versus, yes, it is, but we've created vulnerabilities from I'm trying not to say bad, but from our land use management approaches over the last 120 years, which are very different and extractive and very simplistic when you compare it to what the Coast Salish peoples, their approach, which was diversity for medicines, for food, for art, for all kinds of different purposes, and much more resilient systems than what we're dealing with now. So one of my messages, this is one of my hope, Mary, maybe you need to hear this too. I think that we've created a lot of the problems for ourselves. And the good news is that we can do something about it. That's what I believe.
Good. Well, that's hopeful.
Yeah. Not feeling very hopeful though.
Thank you.
Before I turn you over to Ted Manning, who is the chair of CACOR, I have two comments. First, I want to thank all those who raised questions and engaged Ruth in dialogue. You've enriched the presentation. And I want to just observe, from my sense, that Ruth, you have lived up to and exceeded the way I introduced you. I am thankful not for that and for the fact that you've also saved my reputation.
See the legitimacy thing.
So over to you, Ted.
Oh, thank you very much, Ruth. That was wonderful. I collect success stories, and in fact, that was one of the things that struck me as you started. I am from Courtenay, British Columbia, and also Prince Rupert. It came home. I haven't lived there for a while now, but yes, it is a very challenging environment, and particularly now when the variables are changing. But I think that what people like you can do is collect success stories. And yours looks very promising to me. We've been doing a lot of work around the world with UN and also lately with the Club of Rome, looking at how we can use community level success stories to build towards broader solutions. And as you have found, they don't always transfer very easily. They don't always succeed for very long. However, I see that you have a lot of people involved, a lot of people prepared to cover for each other. We've just been doing stuff in the Galapagos Islands. We found the only reason when the government failed that it continued was the local people, and the World Wildlife Fund stepped in. It's not quite as good as it was when they started, but it takes people. So I'm inspired by what you're doing, and I hope you keep doing it. And when you write more up about results, we would love to take them and share them around the world. We have now an increased link with the Club of Rome and using their mechanisms to share stuff around the world. And I'd very much like to put your success story on it. So thank you very much. The Canadian Association for the Club of Rome is delighted to bring people in who have good ideas and actual results that make a difference. So thank you again. And I would like to also note that we have one every week. We like our members to contribute to keep us in business. We are going to come around very shortly and get you to pay your annual dues, because without that, this stops. And we really do wish to bring you a very interesting case study or solution every week. So again, thank you very much. We would urge people who wish to see it further. It is going on YouTube very shortly. In fact, almost all past presentations are available there. And when you go on, please register and subscribe. It helps us get better known and perhaps make a difference. So thank you all very much. Ruth, thank you ever so much. And we shall talk again later. I have some ideas that might work from you. I was working out there for the Lands Director of Canadian Government of Canada for many years. So I would like to exchange more details.
Welcome. Everyone is welcome to, I mean, I need all the help I can get. And so
Everybody does these days, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Ted.
Thanks.